Hello everyone, this is Michael from salesmate.co, and in today's presentation we're going to be covering why people should be looking at Australia for property investment. So today we'll cover factors such as environment in Australia, lifestyle in Australia, economy, education, and of course the property market in general in Australia. Before we begin, let's just talk about briefly the top 4 factors or reasons why people invest offshore anyway. And the first reason is people invest because of the politics or the political risks in their own respective countries. Now, generally in developing countries, rich people are quite tied with the politics or the politicians. And generally when politicians step down or there is a shake-up or there is a change, rich people are affected. Okay, and therefore it is in their best interest to migrate or perhaps at least transfer their wealth offshore, okay, to mitigate that risk. Second reason is to do with currency. Okay, because of currency exchange rates, generally investing into assets in countries with stable currency can yield good net wealth or growth in people's assets. So, for example, back in March this year, 2020, one Australian dollar was equivalent to 4 Chinese renminbi, which means in order to buy a property that is worth $1 million, back in March, you needed 4 million Chinese renminbi. Now, 4 months later, in July, we're now talking 1 Australian dollar being equivalent to about 5 Chinese renminbi, which means if you bought a property back in March for 1 million Australian dollars, using 4 million renminbi, 4 months later, that asset, without changing its value in Aussie dollar terms, would be equivalent to 5 million Chinese renminbi, which means in 4 months, your net wealth has increased by 20% without you doing anything and without the property even increasing in value. Okay, so having the right currency exchange rates playing in your favor is one big factor why people invest in properties offshore. The third factor is to do with asset protection and also tax optimization. It's always handy to think of different structures, different ways to protect your assets even before you buy your assets. Okay, because in countries like Australia and UK and US, sometimes or even quite often, people can sue you. Creditors, investigators can go after you. And for different reasons, people will go after the assets under your own name. Okay, so it is definitely a bad idea to have assets under your own name. Now, there are different structures such as discretionary trust, family trust, unit trust. There are different ways that you can actually shield your assets away from people who are going to attack you. Okay, and definitely those structures also play a very important role when it comes to optimizing your tax position as well. Okay, so we'll cover those in the next few modules. But definitely asset protection and tax optimization are very important factors when it comes to people investing in properties offshore in countries like Australia. And the fourth reason is generally for people with kids, those parents that have kids that are coming to Australia to study in high school or universities. So generally, those parents might not want the kids to rent a particular place, so they might want to buy a place near the university for their kid or kids to stay in without paying any rent. And hopefully by the time when the kid graduates from the schools or the universities, the property would have increased in value and therefore made it a worthwhile investment. And for sure, when people have the plans to migrate to countries like Australia, before you even come to Australia, it's always good to buy a place before you even come. It's always good to buy as early as you possibly can because the property market in general in Australia would increase over time. So it's good to buy as early as you possibly can. And definitely by the time you get here, you would have got your own property that you can live in straight away. Okay, so these are the 4 different reasons why people buy offshore or in general, why people buy in Australia, as you will see next. And so today we're going to be covering a few topics on why Australia. First of all, look at the environment, then the lifestyle in Australia, the Australian economy, what drives the Australian economy and why it is making Australian economy one of the most stable economy in the world. Education factors in Australia, and look at innovations and how universities have contributed a lot of talents to the Australian industries, and of course the property market, the overall trends of the Australian property market and what drives the stability or the stable growth in the property market in Australia. So let's begin with the environment. So where is Australia? Australia is one of the largest countries in the world, in fact the sixth largest overall, in the Southern Hemisphere, and is one of the few developed nations in the Southern Hemisphere. So in terms of land area, Australia is the sixth overall, with 7.6 million kilometres behind Brazil, USA, China, Canada and Russia. But in terms of population, Australia has 25.6 million people, just a little bit over North Korea. Okay, so in terms of the area per person, it's pretty scarce in Australia. Now, looking at a few states. So Australia has 6 states and 2 territories, often referred to as 8 states. The first one we can look at now is Victoria. Victoria here has about 3% of Australia's land area, but about 25% of Australia's GDP. And its 2 major cities being Melbourne and Geelong. Melbourne has 5.5 million population, second largest city in Australia, and Geelong has about 300,000 population. So you realise here that both Geelong and Melbourne, they're around the Port Phillip Bay in this sort of coast area here, where Captain Cook arrived from England previously to Australia to discover the mainland. Most people actually live around the coast. Okay, so in places like here and here, it's mostly bushland and forest. Hardly there are people that live in those areas. Okay, so generally people live around near the coast. So that was Victoria. Now let's look at New South Wales. So it's a slightly bigger state, and definitely in terms of GDP, it leads all states in Australia, with a few major cities, which include Sydney, close to 6 million population, the largest city in Australia, and also Newcastle and Wollongong together with close to about 1 million in population. Okay, so this is New South Wales. Now you realise there is a gap here. So this little gap here is not New South Wales. It is ACT, okay, which stands for Australian Capital Territory, okay, ACT. And as its name suggests, the metro city within ACT, Canberra, is the capital of Australia, with about 500,000 in population. It's where the parliaments and all the government sectors employment are, okay, in ACT. Now, most land in Australian Capital Territory are not freehold, a leasehold. Okay, leasehold in Australia generally means 99 years of leasehold ownership, whereas most other lands, pretty much everywhere else in Australia, is 9,999 years freehold, if you like. So that's Canberra within ACT. Now let's move up. We've got Queensland. Queensland is known as the Sunshine State, with 2 famous cities being Brisbane and the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is very famous for its beach with sand, just like gold. That's where it gets its name from, the Gold Coast, okay, with about 700,000 population. And Brisbane being the 3rd largest city in Australia with about 2.5 million in population. In terms of housing affordability, Brisbane property market housing is generally more affordable than Melbourne and Sydney. Okay, we'll cover that in the next few modules. So that's Queensland. Then we go to South Australia. If you like red wine, like myself, there's a place here in South Australia called Barossa Valley, very famous for producing very high quality wine, famous for across the world. And in South Australia, Adelaide here is the metro city with 1.4 million population. Very livable city as well, by the way. And as we move west, Australia's largest state is called Western Australia, or WA, with Perth being the capital city of the state with 2.1 million population. So WA generally has the same time zone as most of the Asian countries, like Singapore, China, Japan, and so on and so forth. And then we've got Northern Territory. Northern Territory has Darwin as its capital city with about 200,000 population. And if you're seeing some of the tourism brochures around, you would have seen there is a big red rock that is probably about there called the Woolloomooloo. That's in Northern Territory. Okay, so not a lot of people live in Northern Territory. There are still Aboriginal Australians that live in this state, but generally people live around the coast. Last but not least, an island to the south of Australian mainland called Tasmania, with Hobart being the capital city of about 300,000 people. There are close to 550,000 people live in the whole state, and so about 60% live in Hobart being the capital city. Okay, Tasmania is very famous for its fresh air. In fact, Tasmania has the freshest air, the highest quality of air on planet Earth, okay, as well as some of the most very famous abalones, as well as the lobsters all around the state. Okay, very famous for its seafood. Now, let's talk very briefly about the capital cities and their respective potential growth. So here we have Dr. Andrew Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the leading property economist in Australia, and we work very closely with Dr. Andrew Wilson. Now, Andrew says that Australia's housing market is really affected by three factors, right? The Reserve Bank's interest rate, the population growth in Australia, and the overall investment sentiment that all influence the supply and demand, which is really economics 101. Now, when we look at affordability, affordability is really something that influences investment sentiment. Right? That is the key to the overall purchasing power. Now, let's say, for example, in Brisbane, if we consider an apartment in Brisbane CBD, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and we consider the same apartment in Melbourne CBD, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, the same apartment in Brisbane would be about $90,000 less expensive than that of Melbourne, and $270,000 less expensive than the same 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom apartment in Sydney. Now, these are just approximate figures, okay, based on average and median prices, but you get the idea. The same apartment in different locations, CBD, would have completely different prices for investors. But when you're expecting tenants to move in and pay rent, the rental income for the three apartments, same apartments in different cities, would roughly be the same. Okay, would probably be different there's probably about 10% difference. Okay, which means that the return on investment for anybody that invests into the Brisbane market is going to be higher than the return on investments in Melbourne, which in turn would be higher than the return of investment in Sydney. Okay, so that'll just give you some very basic background information on housing affordability in each of the different capital cities, as well as their future growth or the potential for future growth. Now, let's get to know more about Australia in terms of its world rankings. In terms of the GDP per head, Australia ranks number 7 across all the countries in the world. Now, in this case, we're considering countries with a population of more than 5 million people. Okay, so Australia ranks number 7 in the world behind countries like Ireland, USA, Qatar, Luxembourg, and so on and so forth. Australia is the highest paying country in the world for all employees, okay, with a minimum hourly salary of just under 17 US dollars. Okay, that leads the second place, Luxembourg, by over $2. Okay, Australia crowns the world in terms of the minimum hourly pay. So if anybody wants to come to Australia and work, we have some of the best pays in the world. Quality of air. Now, we just covered that Tasmania has the freshest air in the entire world. Australia has one of the most highest quality of air, just behind New Zealand, in terms of the PM10, which would also make the quality of life very high in Australia. Okay, so in Australia, for example, in Melbourne, we basically just drink the water straight from the tap. Okay, the quality of the water is also very high. So that's just another example of the quality of life. So there is an index by OECD, and Australia ranks number 3 behind Norway and Switzerland in terms of quality of life. And because of that, the life expectancy in Australia is one of the highest in the world as well. Again, we're considering countries with more than population of 5 million. So Australia ranks number 4, just behind Japan, Switzerland, and Spain. In terms of most livable cities in the world, Australia has 4 of the top 10 in the world, led by Melbourne and then followed by Sydney, Adelaide, Perth. I think Brisbane is probably in that list somewhere from time to time. But if you have 4 of the cities in one country that belongs to the most livable cities, top 10 in the world, that says something about that country. In terms of education, Australia has 7 universities that are in the top 100 universities, which makes Australia the 3rd most popular country for foreign students. We'll cover that in a sec. So we have Australian National University in Canberra, University of Sydney in Sydney, University of Melbourne in Melbourne, and University of Tech, UTS in Sydney, University of Queensland, Monash in Melbourne, and the University of Western Australia in WA in Perth. In terms of education, there is an index by OECD back in 2018 to 19. Australia ranks equally number 1 to Denmark with a near perfect score. Now this one basically says how educated people are, in terms of the percentage of people receiving tertiary education. A very high proportion of people in Australia have tertiary degree. So that's a bit more about Australia in terms of the world rankings. Now let's look at Australia in general and look at the different jurisdictions. So in Australia, we have one federal government, as we said, is based in Australian Capital Territory in Canberra, right here. That's the federal parliament. It makes the federal laws. And across the 6 states and the 2 territories, each respective state makes its own laws and regulations. So these are the state laws. And each state has their own capital city. And the state parliament is based in each of the capital cities. So there are 8 of them. And in each state, it is then further broken down into different local councils. We call it LGAs, local government areas. In Australia, there are 537 local councils spread right across Australia, predominantly in the coast areas where 80% of the population is based. So to put into context, let's consider the state of Queensland. Okay, so Queensland state, that's the state, right? Now, as we said, this is actually broken up into different local councils. So let's consider the Brisbane City Council, which would be somewhere around here, right? And these would represent different councils as part of the state. So the Brisbane City Council, this one in red, can then be broken down into different suburbs, where you can see that each suburb has a different code, a postcode. Okay, so these are the suburbs in the Brisbane City Council. Okay, so these are the 3 different levels: the suburb, the council, and the state. And of course, we have the federal above the state. Now, looking at safety, Australia is one of the safest countries in the world. Again, considering the world rankings in terms of the Global Peace Index, Australia is in the top 10. In terms of the least number of killings, Australia is 2nd, just behind New Zealand. Now, again, these rankings are sort of produced based on countries with more than 5 million population. Okay? In terms of the least guns per 100 people, Australia ranks number 1 in terms of the least guns per 100 people for countries above 5 million population. And in terms of the lowest crime rates, Australia is again in the top 10 in the world. So across all those rankings, it makes Australia one of the safest countries with least number of killings, least number of guns, and one of the lowest crime rate. A very safe place to live. Now, looking at the Australian law relevant to property, this is an example of a contract of sale for one of the projects that we're promoting in Brisbane. Australia has a very comprehensive legal system. Now, if you are in China, Japan, Mexico, a lot of the countries around the world, a contract of sale for a property transaction would generally be maybe 20 pages, 50 pages. In Australia, it is usually about 100 pages, even up to 200 pages. Very comprehensive. It gives you all the history about this particular property. It gives all the declarations, the statements from the vendor, so that the buyer can make informed decision when it comes to buying the property. Okay, it has very comprehensive information. Lawyer's trust account. Now, what this means is generally in Australia, when it comes to buying a property, the seller and the buyer would never meet. Okay, so well then how do they do the transactions? Well, generally the buyer has a solicitor, or maybe in certain jurisdictions you might want to call it attorney, and the seller has a solicitor or an attorney. So the buyer's solicitor and the seller's solicitor would talk to each other, or maybe meet each other, to make sure that the deal gets done. Okay, but each solicitor would represent their own client. Right? So the buyer solicitor would act on behalf of the buyer to negotiate terms in favor to the buyer. And the seller's solicitor or attorney would act on behalf of the seller. Okay. Now in this case, when the buyer wants to pay for a deposit, that deposit doesn't get paid into the developer's own account. Okay, otherwise the developer could potentially run away with it. No, it doesn't happen. The buyer pays the deposit into the seller, or in this case, the developer's lawyer's trust account. Okay, the lawyer's trust account, which is monitored by the government. Okay, it is what we call deposit in trust. Okay, so that case, the lawyer holds the deposit in trust for the client. And usually for the length of the development, the developer does not have access to that particular deposit. That deposit gets set into the developer's lawyer's trust account until settlement. Okay, so that money never gets touched at all. Okay, this is just one of the many different things in the Australian legal system that protects the consumer. Professional indemnity insurance, that's an insurance usually paid by the lawyers to cover any losses potentially encountered by their clients. And that's the same with the Legal Practitioners Fidelity Fund. So this one here, it's generally protected by the Law Society, whereas this one is with different insurance companies. Okay, so there are different mechanisms set up in the Australian legal systems and the legal practitioners space to protect the consumers. Cooling off period. Now, what this means is if you as the buyer decides to buy a property today, you sign a contract, and let's say on the contract there is a 3-day cooling off period, it means you have 3 days to potentially regret, okay, even if you have already signed the contract. Okay, so within the 3 days, if you regret and you want to pull out of the contract, yes, you can still do that. Okay, but perhaps there is a little bit of a compensation that you have to pay to the seller. Okay, whether it might be $100 or $200 or 0.1% of the property price, it really depends on the contract. But what this gives is extra room or flexibility for the buyer to perhaps change his or her mind. Okay, again, this is to do with consumer protection. Home loans. Now, in many cases, when buyers sign contract of sale with sellers, some buyers will need to or like to add in a clause that says subject to home loan application or subject to home loan approval, which means even if it's after the cooling off period, the contract gets signed, it becomes a legally binding contract between the buyer and the seller. The buyer then pays the deposit. The buyer then applies for a home loan with a bank. Now, let's say if the bank does not approve the home loan, well, what is the buyer going to do? With a clause that says subject to home loan approval, if for whatever reason the bank does not approve the home loan, it gives the buyer the flexibility to pull out of the contract, okay, without suffering any loss. Again, this is to do with protecting consumers. Okay, so we always recommend buyers to put in this clause, which says subject to home loan. And this is something that, again, we're not lawyers, but we highly recommend all buyers to consult with their own legal practitioners to add in different clauses to protect their interest. Okay, Owners Corporation Law. Now, this is the part of the law that protects people who buy into, for example, an apartment building. Okay, all owners of an apartment building would be protected by the Owners Corporation Law, which would govern things like how the building is to be maintained by the building manager, right, and so on and so forth. So again, this is giving property owners extra protection. And of course, in various states, there are different laws and regulations to protect consumers. Okay, so in terms of the legal environment, Australia is very safe when it comes to dealing with property transactions. There are many things in place to protect you as a buyer.